Imagine standing in the middle of the largest city on Earth in the year 1500. Not London, not Paris, not Rome, but a shimmering island metropolis rising from the surface of a vast lake in the middle of Mexico, home to 250,000 people, laced with canals wider than the streets of any European capital, filled with the smell of fresh flowers from floating gardens that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself, and crowned at its center by a pyramid so tall it scraped the clouds, and so soaked in blood that the Spanish soldiers who first saw it fell to their knees, some in prayer, some in terror, and some in a confusion they would spend the rest of their lives trying to resolve. This was Tenochtitlan. This was the heart of the Aztec Empire. And depending on who's telling you the story, it was either the most magnificent civilization the Western Hemisphere had ever produced, or the most horrifying theocratic killing machine in human history. The truth, as it almost always is far more complicated, far more fascinating, and far more human than either version allows. Because the Aztecs were not a simple people. They were not savages stumbled upon by enlightened Europeans. They were engineers who built aqueducts that delivered fresh water to hundreds of thousands of people. They were poets who composed verses about the fragility of flowers and the inevitability of death. They were astronomers who tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that rivaled anything achieved in the Old World. And yes, they were a civilization that practiced human sacrifice on a scale that remains difficult to fully comprehend even today, not as an aberration, not as a secret shame, but as the very public, deeply theological, cosmologically essential centerpiece of everything they believed about the universe and humanity's place within it. So who were the Aztecs, really? How did a wandering, landless, despised group of migrants become the dominant power of an entire continent? What drove them to build one of the most complex urban societies in human history? And what does it actually mean that they believed the sun would die without the blood of human hearts? To answer any of that, we have to go back, not to the fall, not to the Spanish conquest that every textbook rushes toward, but to the very beginning, to the desert wastelands of northern Mexico, to a people who had nothing, were wanted by nobody, and who would one day rule millions. The Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, and their own origin story begins in a mythical place called Aztlan, a word from which we derive the name Aztec, though they rarely used it themselves. Aztlan was described as a paradise, an island home somewhere to the north, and the Mexica claimed they had been commanded by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and the sun, to leave this paradise and wander south until they found a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent that would mark the spot where they were destined to build the greatest city the world had ever seen. Whether Aztlan was a real place or a mythological construct designed to give a wandering people a sense of divine purpose is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is that by the time the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, they were universally despised. The valley was already occupied by older, more established city-states, sophisticated Nahuatl-speaking peoples who looked at these ragged, aggressive newcomers with a mixture of contempt and alarm. The Mexica were pushed from territory to territory, used as mercenaries by city-states that found them useful for their ferocity, and then expelled when they became inconvenient. They were enslaved at one point by the people of Culhuacan, forced to settle in a snake-infested wasteland called Tizapan, which their hosts assumed would kill them, only for the Mexica to eat the snakes and thrive. They were eventually driven away from Culhuacan after a particularly gruesome incident in which they sacrificed a princess offered to them as a bride and invited her father to witness what they had done, apparently as a theological statement about transformation and divine marriage that their hosts interpreted, understandably, as an act of pure barbarism. They were chased into the marshes of Lake Texcoco with nowhere left to go, and it was there, on a small, swampy, entirely unpromising island in the middle of the lake, that they allegedly saw the eagle on the cactus devouring the serpent, the sign they had been promised. The year, according to their own calendar, was 1 Flint, corresponding approximately to 1325 CE. They called the place Tenochtitlan, meaning place of the prickly pear cactus, and they began to build. What they built over the next 2 centuries is one of the genuine architectural and urban planning miracles of the pre-modern world. Because the island was small and surrounded by water, the Mexica developed a technology called chinampas, artificially created garden plots built by layering aquatic vegetation, mud, and soil into the shallow lake bed, anchored by the roots of willow trees, creating rich, incredibly fertile agricultural platforms that could produce crops several times a year, and which slowly, incrementally, expanded the island's usable land area until the city of Tenochtitlan became a vast, engineered landmass connected to the mainland by 3 enormous causeways wide enough to march 10 men abreast. They built aqueducts to carry fresh water from springs on the mainland, solving the essential problem that an island city faces. Their largest aqueduct, running from Chapultepec, was a double pipe system that allowed one pipe to carry water while the other was cleaned or repaired, an engineering solution that reveals a sophisticated understanding of urban infrastructure that would not look out of place in the Roman Empire. The city was laid out in a grid, divided into 4 great quadrants by canals and roads radiating from the central ceremonial precinct, where the great temple, the Templo Mayor, rose in a stepped pyramid of 2 shrines at its summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and one to Tlaloc, the rain god, representing the dual foundations of Aztec existence: war and agriculture, blood and water, sacrifice and sustenance. The markets of Tenochtitlan were so vast and so sophisticated that when the Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo first walked through the great market of Tlatelolco, the sister city adjoining Tenochtitlan, he wrote that he and his companions stood in amazement, comparing it favorably to the largest markets of Spain, noting the orderliness of the vendors, the variety of goods on offer, ranging from gold and featherwork to live animals, slaves, medicinal herbs, pottery, cloth, and prepared food, and the presence of judges who walked the market, settling disputes on the spot. Diaz, a man who would go on to destroy this civilization, could not help himself from marveling at what he saw. He wrote that some of his fellow soldiers who had traveled to Rome and Constantinople said they had never seen anything as well organized and as impressive as this market. Let that sit for a moment. Men who had seen the great cities of Europe and the Mediterranean could find no better comparison for what they were witnessing. And yet, the Aztec Empire was not built on commerce and engineering alone. It was built on war. From the moment the Mexica established themselves on their island, they understood that survival required power, and power required expansion, and expansion required an army. In 1428, less than a century after founding Tenochtitlan, the Mexica formed the Triple Alliance with the neighboring city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan, overthrowing the dominant regional power of Azcapotzalco in a military campaign that announced to the entire Valley of Mexico that the despised wanderers from the marshes were now the dominant force in Central America. The Triple Alliance became the engine of what we call the Aztec Empire, though it functioned less like a traditional empire, more like a protection racket of staggering scale. Conquered peoples were not always occupied by Aztec garrisons or absorbed into a centralized administrative state, as Rome might have done. Instead, they were required to pay tribute, enormous quantities of cotton, cacao, jade, gold, feathers, rubber, and human sacrificial victims, delivered on a regular schedule, and in exchange, they were largely left to govern themselves. Fail to pay the tribute, resist the arrangement, or make the mistake of killing an Aztec merchant, and the military response was swift, overwhelming, and deliberately terrifying. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1519, the Triple Alliance controlled a territory of approximately 200,000 square kilometers and extracted tribute from roughly 5 to 6 million people, a figure simultaneously a political sovereign, a military commander, and a living representative of divine power on earth. The ninth and most famous holder of this title was Moctezuma II, and his court was a spectacle of wealth and ritual formality that stunned even the most worldly of Spanish observers. When he walked among his subjects, attendants swept the ground before him, and those who approached him were required to keep their eyes lowered and to enter his presence barefoot, wearing plain garments to signify their insignificance before his divinity. He maintained a zoo of animals collected from across the empire,